We start light. It gets dark. Let's talk about it. Number 10. You're probably a worse driver than you think. Quick show of hands. Are you a good driver? Above average, maybe? Yeah. Everyone thinks that. In surveys across multiple countries, somewhere between 80 and 90% of drivers rate themselves as above average, which is, and this is the important part, statistically impossible. Half of all drivers are, by definition, below average. The math doesn't care about your self-assessment. This is called illusory superiority, sometimes the Lake Wobegon effect after the fictional town where all the children are above average. Psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger formalized the research in 1999, finding that people with limited competence in a given area not only perform poorly, but lack the metacognitive ability to recognize that they're performing poorly. The skills required to do something well are largely the same skills required to evaluate whether you're doing it well. If you don't have them, you can't see that you don't have them. Driving is just the most relatable example. The same inflation shows up in intelligence estimates, social skills, attractiveness, sense of humor, and ethical behavior. Across almost every positive trait researchers have measured, the average person rates themselves above average. The gap between self-assessed competence and actual competence is widest in the people who are furthest from the top. You have no reliable internal alarm that fires when your self-assessment is inflated. The feeling of competence and the fact of competence are generated by different systems, and they do not always agree. You probably just thought, yes, but I actually am a good driver. That's the most normal response in the world. But that's kind of the point. Number 9. You don't know why you do what you do. Think about a decision you made recently. Something real. A conversation you had, a choice you made at work, something you said that surprised even you. You know why you did it, right? Maybe not. Psychologist Timothy Wilson spent decades studying what he called the adaptive unconscious, the enormous volume of mental processing that happens outside conscious awareness and drives most of human behavior. His conclusion, laid out in detail across multiple studies, is that the explanations people generate for their own behavior are largely post-hoc constructions. You observe what you did and produce a plausible account of why. The account feels like direct access to your mental states. It is closer to educated guesswork. One of the most striking demonstrations came from a series of studies by Nisbet and Wilson in the 1970s, in which participants made choices, selecting between identical objects, responding to questions, and then explained their reasoning. The explanations were fluent and confident. They were also demonstrably disconnected from the actual causal factors the researchers had manipulated. People cited reasons that had no effect on their choice and ignored factors that had clearly driven it. The introspective reports weren't lies. People genuinely believed them. The conscious mind had no access to the real cause and filled the gap with something coherent. This is your normal operating mode. The narrative you carry about your motivations, your values, your emotional reactions, the story of why you are the way you are, is assembled from inference, not observation. You are not watching your own mental processes. You are watching your behavior from roughly the same vantage point as everyone else and generating explanations. The explanations feel like self-knowledge. The distance between those two things is larger than you've been assuming. Number 8. You're a different person in different rooms. This one's gonna sting a little. Think about how you are at work versus how you are at home, with your oldest friend versus with someone you just met. Are those the same person? Psychologist Walter Mischel spent years challenging the assumption that they are. His situationist research, controversial when published in the late 1960s and still debated today, found that the correlation between how people behave in different situations is significantly weaker than intuition suggests. People who are generous in one context are not reliably generous in another. People who are honest with strangers are not reliably honest with family. The behavior is less a readout of fixed internal traits and more a response to situational factors that vary constantly. You are more patient at work than at home, more honest in writing than in conversation, more moral when you're not in a hurry, more generous when you're not hungry, more confident when you're around people who expect confidence from you. The people in your life don't know the same person. They know the version of you that their specific context reliably produces. Your colleagues know one pattern. Your family knows another. Your oldest friend knows a third. These versions share a name and a face and a broad outline. The details diverge more than you'd be comfortable with if you mapped it. This isn't a diagnosis. It isn't hypocrisy. The entry isn't that you're fake. It's that the stable, continuous self you experience as an entity may be less a fixed thing and more a recurring habit, a pattern that regenerates in broadly similar form across contexts while varying more in the specifics than your self-concept accounts for. The self as a habit rather than an object. You can feel the difference if you sit with it. Number 7. You're wrong about how you'll feel. Think of something you're really looking forward to. How good is it going to feel? Now think of something you're dreading. How bad? Whatever you just estimated, the research says you're wrong on both counts. Daniel Gilbert at Harvard has spent his career studying affective forecasting, which is the brain's attempt to simulate future emotional states. The consistent finding is that people overestimate the emotional intensity of future events and, more significantly, overestimate their duration. Good things won't feel as good as long as you think. Bad things won't feel as bad as long as you think. The technical term for the second half of that is the psychological immune system, the brain's largely unconscious capacity to rationalize, reframe, adapt, and find meaning in almost any outcome. It is extremely good at its job. You are almost entirely unaware of it. Gilbert's studies on lottery winners and people who suffered serious injuries found that both groups returned to near baseline happiness levels within roughly a year. The people who lost the ability to walk were not, on average, substantially less happy than the people who had won significant prizes a year out. Both groups had drastically miscalculated. The practical consequence of this runs throughout daily life. The dread you feel about a difficult conversation, the anticipation you feel about a vacation, the fear you feel about a decision, these emotional states are generated by a forecasting system that is measurably, consistently miscalibrated. You are spending real emotional resources on simulated futures that will not feel the way you're currently experiencing them. The fear is real. The thing you're afraid of probably won't be. Number 6. Your personality was largely decided before you could object. This one started before you got here. What's a trait you'd use to describe yourself? Something that feels core, patient, anxious, curious, guarded. When do you think that started? Earlier than you think. Possibly before you had words for it. Jerome Kagan at Harvard ran one of the longest temperament studies ever conducted, tracking children from infancy into adulthood. He found that behavioral inhibition, broadly how cautious, anxious, and reactive a child was to novelty, measured at 4 months, predicted personality outcomes with meaningful accuracy decades later. Not perfectly, not rigidly, but the signal was there in infancy and it persisted. Layer onto that the attachment research, early caregiving environments calibrate stress response systems, emotional regulation, and relationship patterns in ways that remain detectable in adulthood. The anxious or avoidant attachment patterns formed before age 2 show up in how adults navigate conflict, intimacy, and trust. Not inevitably, not immutably, but at rates that are hard to dismiss. A significant portion of what you experience as your personality, the traits you've built an identity around, the tendencies you've learned to describe as just how you are, was substantially shaped before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate any of it. Before you had language, before you had preferences about who you wanted to become. This isn't determinism. People change. The entry isn't that you're stuck. It's that the degree to which yourself was shaped by factors entirely outside your control, your genes, your earliest environment, caregivers you didn't choose, is larger than most people's self-concept makes room for. You didn't build yourself from scratch. You inherited a starting configuration and worked from there. Most people feel, on some level, that they chose who they are. The timeline on that choice starts later than it feels like it does. You arrived mid-sentence and thought you wrote the whole thing. Number 5. Your values shift more than you think. Everyone thinks they'd be the one who stops. If you walked past someone dying in a doorway, would you stop? Most people think they would. Most people wouldn't. In 1973, Princeton psychologists John Darley and Daniel Batson ran a study with seminary students, people who had devoted their lives to religious ethics. Participants were asked to prepare a talk, then walk across campus to deliver it. Some were told they were late. Some were told they had plenty of time. On the way, each passed a person slumped in a doorway, apparently in distress. The single strongest predictor of whether a seminarian stopped to help was whether they were in a hurry. Not their religious beliefs, not their self-reported compassion, not their stated values, whether they were running late. Among those told they were already late, 90% walked past. Some stepped over the person. Several were on their way to give a talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan. The gap between moral self-concept and moral behavior is one of the most replicated findings in social psychology. People believe their values are stable, load-bearing, resistant to situational pressure. The research finds that situational factors, time pressure, social context, ambient mood, proximity to other people, override stated values with uncomfortable regularity, and that people dramatically underestimate this in advance. You are not immune. The research doesn't identify a subset of people with exceptionally stable values who reliably act on them under pressure. It finds the gap across the board. This isn't an argument that your values aren't real. It's an argument that the relationship between your values and your behavior under pressure is significantly more fragile than your self-concept currently accounts for. You'd like to think you'd stop. Most people would like to think that. Number 4, you misremember who you were. Think about a strong opinion you hold right now. How long have you felt this way? Picture yourself 5 years ago. Did you feel the same? You probably think you did. You probably didn't quite. Psychologist Michael Ross studied what he called the consistency bias, the tendency for people to reconstruct memories of their past selves to align with who they currently are. If you hold a strong view now, you will misremember having held it more strongly in the past than records indicate. If you've changed significantly, you will underestimate the degree of change. If your current self is kinder, more patient, more confident than you used to be, the memory of your past self shifts toward your current state. The self-concept in the present reaches backward into autobiographical memory and edits. The past self gets rewritten to look more like a coherent earlier draft of the current self, more intentional, more consistent, more continuous than the actual record would support. Ross verified this in studies tracking people's actual opinions over time and then asking them to recall earlier positions. The recall was systematically distorted toward current views. People were not lying. They genuinely remembered holding positions they had not held, with the confidence of actual memory. Your autobiography, the story you tell about how you became who you are, the through line you've constructed from childhood to now, is partially fiction. The person you remember being is a character your current self wrote retroactively, edited for coherence, given motivations that make sense from where you're standing now. You have been revising your own origin story continuously. You have not been informed of the edits. Number 3, you are not the same person you were 10 years ago. And you'll deny it. You're going to disagree with this one. Think about who you were 10 years ago. The opinions you held, the things you cared about, the person you were in your closest relationships. Pretty different, right? Now think about who you'll be in 10 years. Probably pretty similar to now, you think. That's the end of history illusion, named by Daniel Gilbert and colleagues after a study published in 2013. They asked people of all ages to report how much they had changed in the past decade and to predict how much they would change in the next one. Across every age group, the pattern was identical. Substantial reported change in the past, minimal anticipated change in the future. The 20-year-olds thought they were basically done. The 50-year-olds thought they were basically done. Everyone at every life stage experienced their current self as approximately the finished version. The prediction was wrong at every age. The data showed that people continued changing in values, personality, preferences, and relationships at roughly the rates they had changed before, regardless of how complete they felt. The person you will be in 10 years will look back at who you are right now, the same way you look back at yourself 10 years ago, with recognition, with some affection, and with a specific kind of disbelief at certain things you currently think are settled. You cannot feel that from inside the present. The present always feels like arrival. It isn't. You're still in transit. You just can't tell. Number 2, you don't know what you actually want. What do you actually want from your life, your relationships, your days? You probably have an answer. You've probably had it for a while. The behavioral economics research suggests that answer is partially constructed on the spot. Psychologists and economists studying preference formation have found that preferences are frequently not retrieved from a stable internal set of desires. They're generated in the moment of choice. What you want in the abstract and what you choose when the choices concrete diverge consistently. What you want when calm and what you want when hungry, tired, anxious, or socially observed are measurably different people making measurably different decisions. Researcher Paul Slovic demonstrated that the way a choice is framed changes not just which option people select, but what they report wanting. Eldar Shafir's work showed that people's preferences reverse depending on whether they're asked what they would choose or what they would reject. Different framings of the identical choice producing opposite results. The preferences aren't being accessed, they're being generated by the framing and then experienced as pre-existing. This matters beyond consumer choices. It extends to the large decisions. The relationships you pursue, the careers you stay in, the version of your life you're working toward. The wants driving those decisions are not being read off a stable internal preference set that is reliably and stably yours. They are context-sensitive outputs of a system that generates wants on demand and then presents them as discoveries. The wants feel like yours because you're the one having them. That's true. But who is the you that's having them? And how consistent are they across the contexts that keep changing? Number 1. There may not be a self to be wrong about. Here's where we land. Philosopher Daniel Dennett and psychologist Dan McAdams approached this from different disciplines and arrived at the same place. The self is a narrative, not a metaphor for a narrative. A literal story the brain generates continuously, assembling the raw stream of experience into a protagonist, someone with consistent traits, a coherent history, values that persist across time, a continuous identity that links who you were to who you are to who you'll be. The research doesn't suggest this story is false, it suggests it's generative. The self isn't underneath the story, waiting to be accurately described. The story is the mechanism by which the self is produced. You are not a person who tells a story about themselves. You are, in a neurologically meaningful sense, the story, and it has been telling parts of it wrong for a while. Every one of those errors, inflating your competence, generating explanations for behavior and calling them reasons, producing different personalities in different rooms and calling all of them you, miscalculating how future events would feel, shaping you before you could consent to it, folding under situational pressure, rewriting your past for consistency, assuming the current draft was final, constructing your wants from context and calling them desires. That was the same system telling you all of this. The same system you've been trusting for the last 20 minutes. The checker and the checked are the same thing. There is no third position, no outside vantage point, no version of you that stands apart from what's happening and evaluates it clearly. You cannot step outside the narrative to verify it. You are the narrative. And it has been getting some significant things wrong about you and about itself. For as long as it's been running. It's still running. That's all I got for today. Subscribe if you want more.